We've got a fantastic lineup of speakers and friendly dragons, as you can see on the screen, and I'll introduce those in a while. I think we'll get started because we have got a lot to get through today, this evening. So welcome to this Economic and Social Research Council Festival of Social Science event on problem debt, hosted by the University of Birmingham. As you can see on the screen, we've got a fantastic set of speakers and friendly dragons, and I'll explain what we mean by that shortly. I'm Karen Rowlingson. I'm Professor of Social Policy and a member of the Research Centre CHASM at the University of Birmingham, and we'll put the link in the chat so that you can find out more about CHASM if you'd like to do so. But I think we'll start on the main part of the event. So in terms of the format of the event, it's going to be slightly unusual. I'm going to start with briefly introducing you to some of the key issues in relation to problem debt. And then we're going to ask you as the audience members to vote on 7 broad policy areas before you've even heard the discussion, the debate. And don't worry if you don't know much about the topic, that's absolutely fine. Or you might be an expert. Whatever your knowledge, we'd like you to vote on these at the start, and then you'll have another chance at the end to vote. So we'll see if, on aggregate at least, people's views have changed. Once you've had a chance to vote on these different areas, the speakers will have 5 minutes each to outline 2 policy pitches. And then we will go straight to the friendly dragons for them to ask questions. They'll have 5 minutes each to ask the speakers about their policy ideas. And at that stage, we will then open to the audience, to yourselves, to ask questions or give comments or even perhaps suggest alternative policy approaches that haven't been discussed so far. And to do that, please use the Q&A, the question and answer facility in Zoom. So the only scary dragon here is going to be me, because I've warned the speakers already that they've got 5 minutes and that's it, and then we'll be moving on. So because we have got a lot to get through. So otherwise, we're going to take a broad kind of Dragon's Den approach, but in a very friendly, informal way. Okay. I would like to also mention that we do have an evaluation questionnaire at the end. We're going to pop it in the chat sort of shortly, so you've got the link and you can take a copy of that, but it'll also go in at the end of the session, so you can also take a copy, and we'll email you a copy of the link to the evaluation questionnaire. We're really keen to find out what you think about this event and this format, and what you thought about the discussion. So you can carry fill in that evaluation questionnaire at your leisure. Okay, so moving on very quickly to very brief introduction to some of the key issues. So the timing of this event is deliberately coinciding with the publication of the University of Birmingham's annual Financial Inclusion Monitor report. It's the 9th in a series of 10 reports funded by the Friends Provident Foundation and Barrow Cadbury Trust, for which many thanks go to Danielle Walker-Palmer and Debbie Pippard for all their support for the research. You can find a copy of the report on our website at University of Birmingham, and we'll pop a link in the chat that you can take a look at it for later on. It's full of lots of figures on the state of financial inclusion in the UK, and shows that problem debt was an issue well before COVID, but it's increased markedly over the past year or so. According to the Financial Conduct Authority, there were 8.5 million adults in financial difficulty in October 2020, which is an increase from 7.2 million before COVID in February 2020. In January 2021, the Standard Life Foundation reported that 10% of the public had fallen behind with household bills and 15% had fallen behind with unsecured credit commitments. The most common bills that people struggle to pay include council tax, rent, electricity and water. And Step Change Debt Charity have estimated that 4.3 million adults were behind on household bills in January 2021. These are very significant numbers, but behind every one of these, there is an impact on people's mental health, physical health, relationships, employment and housing, sometimes leading people to lose their jobs, their homes, and even ultimately to take their own lives. So this is a very serious and significant issue. What do we do about it? How do we tackle this problem debt crisis? So these are the 7 policy areas that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about whether we need tougher regulation of consumer credit, increased financial education in schools, increased benefits for people on low incomes, policies to reduce the cost of renting, more support for private renters who have got into arrears, reduced council tax bills for those on low incomes, or more support for people to save. And what we'd like you to do now, we're going to pop the poll on the screen, I hope, that you'll be able to see, and to vote for up to 3 of these different policy areas that you think should be prioritised. So if you can choose now, you can choose 1, 2 or 3, which ones, and we won't be able to see which ones you voted for, so it's going to be anonymous. Just have a pop in whatever you think. Don't worry if you don't know very much about the topic, just have a go at what you think seems to be most relevant in this field. Which of these would you think are the priorities? You can put top 1, 2 or 3. We'll give you another moment to vote. I'll say you can vote again at the end when you've had a bit more time to have a think about these issues and listen to the speakers and the dragons. So just have a go now for any thoughts you have. I'll give you another few moments. Your first thoughts on this. Increased benefits for people on low incomes coming up top at the moment. Maybe I shouldn't prompt you by saying, I'm not sure if you can see the scores. And just 1 or 2 more. Anybody else want to? Nearly everyone has popped an idea or 2 in there. So I think we're going to call it now. So we'll call it now. If we can take a screenshot of that and end the poll. I don't know if the audience can see the poll, but we'll maybe show you that later if you can't see it at the moment. But increased benefits for people on low incomes comes top. Then we've got increased financial education in schools, policies to reduce the cost of renting, then tougher regulation of consumer credit, then reduced council tax bills, then more support for private renters in arrears, and finally more support for people to save. So that's the kind of spread of thoughts at this stage, but we'll take another look at the end and see if you've changed your minds at all. Okay, so if we move on to our speakers. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over straight away to Mike Brewer, the first of our speakers. Mike is Chief Economist and the Deputy Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation. So over to you, Mike, for 5 minutes to put your policy pitches to our dragons and broader audience.
Thank you very much, Karen. The starting point for my pitch is that one of the causes of debt becoming problem debt is when people experience a shock to their income. A gap emerges between their incomings and their outgoings, and people can't close that gap quickly enough. And one contributor to this gap persisting is that our social security system is not very good at providing insurance or protection when people do experience a hit to their earnings. And we see this in the pandemic. Many people have argued that the fact that the government had to introduce the job retention scheme, the furlough scheme, was a recognition that our existing social security system wasn't up to the job. And plenty of statistics show that the UK does very poorly in the way we support people who do lose their job. For a single person with no children, we are bottom across all OECD countries, all 30-something equally developed countries, when we look at the level of unemployment benefit relative to average earnings. Now, we do a bit better at protecting families with children, but we're still down the bottom quarter of the international league table. Just before the pandemic hit, we did some research that showed by how much a family's income would fall if someone in the family lost their job. And that calculation gives us something called a replacement rate. And we found the typical replacement rate was 50%. So that means that for half the population, if they lost their job, their family income would be less than half than what it was when they were employed. Single people, young people, and high earning people will be particularly likely to face those low replacement rates, so really hit by a big income shock if they were to become unemployed. But then the job retention scheme came along through the pandemic, and that meant that most employees who were furloughed would see their family income fall only very slightly. The typical furloughed employee had a family income about 90% of what it was when they were in work properly before the pandemic hit, much better than that 50% replacement rate. And I've talked about unemployment, but we can also see this very weak level of insurance or income protection also applies to people who become too ill to work. So the rates of our core benefit there, ESA, Employment and Support Allowance, they're not related to your past earnings, and they didn't even see the £20 a week uplift during the pandemic. So how could we solve this? So I'm not proposing an across the board increase in benefits to low-income families. I'm proposing an increase in benefits to prevent people from becoming low-income families. And the reason we have this very poor protection against unemployment is that when you are unemployed, our core benefit system pays you something that bears no resemblance to your previous earnings. Now, there are many ways you could fix this, but for tonight, my proposal is that we reform unemployment benefit or job seekers allowance so that for 3 months, it pays you 80% of your previous earnings, capped at £2,500 a month, broadly matching the rules of the job retention scheme. And that's my suggestion.
That's great, Mike. Did you have another one, or are you?
I just stick with that one. I'll just stick.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And that's well within your 5 minutes. So we'll leave you there, and we'll move on to our second speaker, and that's Christopher Gertz, Senior Lecturer in Macroeconomics at the University of Birmingham's Business School.
Thank you very much, Karen. So as we have just heard, problem debt can arise from adverse income shocks, but it can also arise from excessive spending. And in the following, I will suggest 2 policies that track problem debt by addressing the issue of excessive spending. So problem debt has increased, as we have heard from Karen, during the pandemic, and we really need to break this trend. And I'm suggesting one policy that helps in the short run and one policy that helps to tackle the issue in the long run. My first policy to fight problem debt in the short run is to introduce tougher regulation of consumer credit, and in particular regarding the buy now, pay later industry. Buy now, pay later companies are fintech firms that have taken online shopping by storm over the past few years. And they allow customers to stagger payments for products such as clothes and furniture with no interest or fees. Well, that's unless customers fail to pay back on time, of course, when fees get quite hefty. The organization Which estimates that buy now, pay later products have reached by now 1/3 of UK customers. And importantly, 27% of buy now, pay later customers said that they were turning to the services because they could not afford the purchase outright. Buy now, pay later may be dangerous for consumers because it's not regulated like other credit products. Therefore, some people are able to take out credit they otherwise would not be able to obtain. And Citizens Advice used a very good analogy in that they say that buy now, pay later borrowing can be like quicksand, very easy to slip in and very difficult to get out. Buy now, pay later is sold and advertised as a lifestyle choice, something cool or a new high-tech way to pay. Advertising is done by Instagram and other such services where they push feel-good hashtags of buy now, pay later companies, which is really not appropriate for a credit product. It should be seen for what it is, really, a debt. A new document from the Treasury indicates that legislation that may come in 2022 or even 2023 will be less tough than some have called for, and may explain why leading buy now, pay later players were quite quick to welcome the long-awaited consultation on how the industry should be policed. I am particularly calling for tough regulation of this industry, including specific measures such as transparent background checks to protect customers from problem debt, particular checks concerning affordability, problem borrowing or lending to people already in vulnerable circumstances, regulation of advertisements of buy now, pay later products, including a ban of feel-good adverts and direct links to free debt advice services that come with the ads, avoidance of consumer confusion by clear labeling of buy now, pay later products as credit products and clear explanations of risks arising from missed payments. And lastly, introducing of an ombudsman where consumers can turn to if there are issues. That's my first policy. My second policy is to fight problem debt in the long run. And in particular, I propose to raise knowledge on topics around personal finances by making financial literacy a compulsory subject at school. Why is it important to complement our efforts to fight problem debt today with a policy to fight problem debt in the long run? Well, we have lived in an environment with stable and near zero interest rates for 13 years now. And a change to this regime with rising and more volatile interest rates is expected to happen in the near future. Many young consumers are not used to and are not expecting this new regime with higher cost of credit and the need for larger risk buffers. For this reason, we need to educate future generations of consumers and provide more financial education at schools. Many kids and young adults lack the financial literacy to adequately judge their debt capacity in such a regime. Rather than by considerations of affordability, purchases in early life are often driven by consumption behavior of peers or by commonly accepted and seemingly corrected general wisdom. And this is often a result of lack of financial knowledge and insecurity about financial matters. Topics on personal finances are not consistently covered as part of school education. Now, I propose to make the subject financial literacy compulsory at adult schools, and it should provide an understanding of topics such as bank accounts and differences between debit and credit cards, risks and opportunities that arise from loans and mortgages, savings, interest rates and financial planning, understanding interests of financial intermediaries, which may not always be aligned with the customer's interests, protection from debt and bankruptcy, and where to find help on debt-related questions. So to finish off, a lack of financial literacy is one of the drivers of problem debt. The subject financial literacy should be part of every pupil's education for at least one term in years 10 or 11 to ensure they have a degree of understanding about their finances that prepares them for life after school.
Lovely, thanks, Christoph, very well timed. So we've got a few different ideas here. I see people already putting some links into the chat. Please continue to do that. If you have any questions, you can start putting them in the Q&A. We'll look at them after the dragons have had their turn, but do feel free to start putting questions in as they occur to you. Thanks very much, Christoph. And now we're over to Stephen McKay, Distinguished Professor in Social Research at the University of Lincoln.
Okay, thank you for that. Must admit, the last time I spoke without slides, most people were using typewriters like the one we just saw behind Christoph. So somewhat unfamiliar way of presenting to me. But anyway, my basic insight, somewhat like my Brewer's, of course, is that we should tackle debt either by tackling increasing people's incomes or by reducing the costs they face. So I'm going to propose one idea, which is about improving incomes, and one which is about decreasing spending. I've decided to look at quite large reforms, which I acknowledge are perhaps harder to implement, but I think they're what you need for the kind of large-scale change we're looking for. I also want to talk about a few areas of change in society that I think are not as well known as they should be. So first of all, I'd like to talk a bit about universal credit, because for many poorer families, their incomes will depend on levels of universal credit, since that's the main source of their income. Now, there are various parts of universal credit about which we could talk, but what I'm going to focus on for today is what's called the two-child limit. And this was introduced for those born from 2017 onwards, where you get benefit amounts which would essentially pay amounts relating to one child or two, but with no more than that. And this was described, when it was introduced by Professor Jonathan Bradshaw, as being, quotes, the worst social security policy ever. And as you can imagine, that's up against some pretty strong competition. To give some idea of amounts, the rate for a second child at the moment is just over $2,800 per year, or £50 a week. And that's roughly what families are losing out on the new system with the two-child limit compared to what happened before. I'd also say that it's not just about the rates of benefit, it also affects childcare costs. So although the government argues, I think rightly, that people should try to work their way out of poverty, or work is the best way out of poverty, they only provide childcare costs, which essentially are capped for 2 children with no more for 3 or more, so making it hard for those people to get out of work. And again, one of the things that's not as well known as it should be is that overall rates of child poverty are quite closely related to the poverty rate among larger families. Recent research by Doctors Kitty Stewart, Erin Rees and Ruth Patrick says most of the fall in child poverty in the UK is a story about poverty in larger families. So if you track under New Labour, almost all the fall in child poverty was due to falling poverty among those with 3 or more children. If you look at the currently rising rates of child poverty, that's almost entirely down to poverty among larger families, those with 3 or more children. So obviously there was a cost-saving motive to introduce a 2-child limit. It costs roughly 1.4 billion a year, so it's a rough guide of what it should be. In terms of how it affects things like births, again, on my list of lesser known facts, in 2012, the average woman was having 1.9 children. Last year, that was down to 1.58 children, quite a large drop over a short period of time. So that's something else we could come back to. My second measure, however, is about reducing spending, and in particular, the housing sector and the growth of the private rented sector. The private rented sector, of course, has much higher levels of rent than social tenants. Median rent at the moment for private tenants about 730 a month, roughly double that in London. Now, private tenancies themselves may not be necessarily a bad thing, but certainly in England, we don't tend to regulate them all that well. Again, this is an area where there's been quite rapid change. So back in the year 2000, not that long ago, there's about 1 in 10 or 2 million people in private renting. That's gone up to more than 4.5 million, more than doubling in that time. And now we have roughly 1 in 4 families who live in private rented sector, with people paying about 40% of their income in rent. And the pandemic showed, among other things, that intervention is certainly possible if there's a political will to do so. So during the pandemic, we had an end to eviction and a very large increase, or relatively large increase, in the amount of rent that would be paid by benefits. In the preceding 5 years, the rates you would get for rent had stayed fixed in cash terms. During the pandemic, they were raised back to where they had been, to 30% of local rents. So sadly, many of those changes have been rolled back, but what I'm arguing is we need to be reconsidering the local housing allowance rates to back to where they were before, to look at what happens with rental prices. So my two policies are to look at benefits for larger families on the income side, and to tackle high rent or ways of meeting high rents on the spending side. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Also very well timed. So no pressure on the next and last speaker. That's Famida Rahman, a senior policy advocate at Step Change Debt Charity. So over to you, Famida.
Yeah, so I have taken a slightly different approach in that, sort of working for a debt advice service, we have access to a lot of information on the debts that people face. So what I've done is looked at the specific debt problems that we've had and picked some of the more pressing ones. So the first one that I've picked, like Steve, is to do with private renters. And I'm sort of proposing to strengthen support for private renters at risk of financial difficulty. So we find the share of people living in privately rented accommodation has been on the up for a long time now. And this shows up in debt advice. So PRS tenants are the fastest growing demographic in Step Change's client base. And by 2020, over a third of our clients were in this tenure. The combination of higher relative housing costs, so PRS renters spend almost a third of their incomes on housing costs, compared to about 27% for social renters and 18% for mortgages. And the insecurity of this tenure make this a major area of concern for problem debt. Our figures suggest that this insecurity is likely to drive a higher usage of unsecured credit, with private rented sector tenants having much higher levels of unsecured credit than other renters. The difference is largest amongst those without rent arrears, with unsecured debt to income ratios reaching 90% for this group. We also find that when faced with financial difficulty, people will often rightly prioritise paying their rental costs for fear of losing their home. So by the time people are missing their rent payments, it's very likely that they're already facing quite difficult financial circumstances and choices. So in terms of policies, of course, we should look to make housing more affordable, but we should also improve security for private renters so that they're less likely to be driven to use unsustainable forms of credit in order to sustain their tenancies. What does this look like? So the government are already consulting on the removal of Section 21 no-fault evictions, which is a major cause of insecurity in the private rented sector. But in doing so, it is proposing to strengthen other grounds for repossession to balance landlords and tenants' interests. So this includes reducing the grounds for possession with arrears from under Section 8 from 2 months to 1 month. And I think that's the wrong way to go about it, because it's likely to worsen the problems that I've just outlined. Instead, the government should look to strengthen support for PRS renters facing financial difficulty. The private rented sector should be put on par with the social rented sector and mortgage market, which are both protected by pre-action protocols, which include requirements for landlords or banks to work with people to come to reasonable repayment plans, and possession claims are postponed while the person pursues any benefit claims, which can take time and are often subject to delays. This will allow people to sort of finally seek advice and get themselves back on their feet before sort of losing their housing. And a pre-action protocol is a check against hasty or capricious evictions and housing insecurity. And landlords will still be able to evict tenants who refuse to pay or don't agree and keep up a reasonable repayment plan. So the balance that the government is trying to achieve will still exist. These provisions place an emphasis on supporting people to get back on their feet prior to being made homeless, rather than evicting them, which is in the long-term interests of tenants, landlords, and the state. As tenancies are sustained, homes are not sat empty, and councils have fewer demands on their homelessness support services. So that was policy number one. And policy number two is to do with council tax, and it's for better support for low-income households. So council tax is highly regressive, with lower income households spending a much higher proportion of their incomes on tax than those higher incomes. And in the context of debt advice, it's the household bill that people are most likely to be in arrears on. So it was 37% of clients in our latest stats were in arrears on council tax. I'm not going to dwell on the design so much, as we all know that needs reform. What I'm going to talk about is the support infrastructure that surrounds the tax. So government figures show that over £4.4 billion of council tax arrears was owed to local authorities in England in the last year. And the amount of council tax that's owed to local authorities has been on the up since before the pandemic, with those in receipt of means-tested benefits most likely to be in arrears. Research by the Money Advice Trust finds that this increase in council tax arrears in England directly correlates with the devolution of council tax support in 2013, which was accompanied by a 10% reduction in funding for schemes, leading many councils to adopt a system of minimum payments for people of working age who would previously have been eligible for 100% support with their council tax bill, a change that didn't take place in Wales, where we don't see the same effect. So I think I'm going to skip some of this. So during COVID, recognising the difficulties that families faced in meeting the costs, the government provided additional funding via £500 million hardship fund to supplement council tax support schemes, and this was later topped up by a further £670 million. But given the increase in hardship caused by the inability to pay council tax has been increasing prior to the pandemic, and with the cost of living on the rise, the government needs to go beyond the COVID limited support that is currently available and commit to long-term investment in council tax support for those on lower incomes. And of course, in the long term, we'd like to see a wholesale reform of the tax, which reduces the disproportionate burden of council tax on lower income households once and for all. So that's me. Thank you.
Wow, again, fantastically timed, and a really interesting mix of policy ideas here, from the very sort of preventative ones to the ones to look at how you alleviate people that have accumulated debt, looking at broad policies relating to social security, financial education, consumer credit legislation, and more specific policies around council tax and housing and so on. So thank you very much for those, the four speakers. That was absolutely brilliant. So now we're going to turn to our four friendly dragons to ask you some questions. They might ask questions of particular speakers or a question across for all speakers to respond to. It's very relaxed and informal in terms of how we do this. But our first friendly dragon is Jodie Gardner. She's lecturer in private law and fellow of St John's College, University of Cambridge. So over to you, Jodie, for 5 minutes to ask some friendly questions to our speakers. And
Okay.
please do, audience, put in questions in a Q&A if you'd like to.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you all for your suggestions. They are a fabulous mix, as Karen said. I've got a little bit of a question for each person. Sometimes it's just clarification, or sometimes it's wanting a bit of expansion. So with Mike, your idea of 3 months capped at 2,500, I just wanted to know, particularly in light of the fact that you said it was the higher income people who are likely to be really affected by this replacement rate and losing their main breadwinner, why the justification to cap it in that light? because COVID has highlighted that vulnerability means many different things. And if you're living in London with an incredibly high rental, or you've got a large mortgage and your income goes, your expenses are high, likely to be high if you've got a high income. So whether there was something to do there with requiring insurance or encouraging people who earn a higher amount to get insurance. I also thought, where did the justification for 3 months come in? Because it seems like a very short amount of time to get everything on board and clarify everything. And I think a lot of other countries have a much longer period of time. And again, COVID has shown us that 3 months, goes by very, very quickly. And if you look at the number of times we needed to keep extending the furlough, it shows that when things get bad, they can get really bad for quite a long period of time. Christos, buy now, pay later is a really interesting thing. And as a lawyer, you will have no complaints from me that we need to regulate this a bit more. But I thought that your theory behind focusing on buy now, pay later was about trying to reduce consumption. And I'm not convinced it will, because I feel that inappropriate or excessive spending is a little bit like whack-a-mole. And you smack down one way that they can excessively spend and something else will pop up. And it's no surprise whatsoever that buy now, pay later products have exploded very quickly after payday lending and other sorts of high cost credit were very much regulated. So I wonder whether regulating buy now, pay later, whilst a useful thing to do, might not actually address the underlying point, which was excessive spending. And I remember a few years ago listening to a bunch of psychologists talk about excessive spending and saying that the real issues are not about regulating or stopping access to credit, because they'll always find some way to get credit, but it's about changing advertising and changing social norms and treating the cause, not the symptom for these issues. Steve, universal credit. As a mother of 4, I love to encourage a big family, so you won't have any criticisms about removing the child limit. I just had one question about your figures. So you say in 2012, 1.9 children per female, and in 2020 that had gone to 1.58. Now, I remember reading something about the 2-child limit and saying it actually hadn't impacted the birth rate of low-income people, particularly. So these statistics seem to indicate that it might have, or the lower birth rates are not being impacted by the people who are actually subject to the 2-child limit. So I was wondering whether you had any more figures to kind of highlight how that reduction went across different income decimals. And finally, with the rental income and tackling high rent, I probably don't need to ask this question because Famida did such a fabulous job of following you, backing up your point, and provide some really detailed guidance, because I said, yes, we absolutely need to tackle high rent. And, too much of the UK is a postcode lottery. Now, if you can get access to council housing, you get subsidized rent and you get that security. And if you don't, your life is much, much worse. But I wanted to have more information on how we should actually do this, because we also have property rights in the UK, and you don't want to start introducing rent ceilings or any of those on private rental market, because that has some really nasty and unintended consequences. So in light of everything that Famida said about addressing the issues with private rental, I was just wondering if you had anything else to add to that. And finally, Famida, thank you so much for mentioning council tax. It's really, really important. And it's something that really does not get the attention that it very much deserves. The one thing I was surprised about is you didn't mention anything about enforcement. It was all about, addressing the development of council tax, but actually the enforcement of council tax is a huge problem. And I was actually reading something today from Step Change about High Court enforcement officers. And with the way that the way that councils collect council tax and other sort of household bills is by bailiffs. And that's an incredibly expensive and very, very exploitative method of getting debts back. And in fact, Step Change did some research on it, and £1,000 of council tax, by the time you've gone through all the enforcement steps with a High Court bailiff, results in having to pay back £2,285. So it more than doubles the amount that people have to pay back. So I was wondering whether you had any suggestions to tackle that aspect of council tax as well. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Jodie. What we're going to do is go through all the friendly dragons to ask all their questions, and then we'll go back around the speakers to give some comments back. So we'll do it in that order, if that's okay. So Jodie, hold on and you'll get your responses shortly, but we'll take all the questions and comments first. Thank you very much for that. Our next friendly dragon is Rajiv Prabhakar, Senior Lecturer in Personal Finance at the Open University. So over to you, Rajiv.
Hi, Karen. Thanks a lot. I'll keep this brief. Thanks to all the panelists for a great set of ideas, which cover, for me, the kind of three main ways of trying to reduce problem debt, either by increasing income in some way, protecting income through reforms to unemployment benefit or universal credit, cutting spending in some way, looking at, for example, the role that's been highlighted to do with housing, or finally, debt management. I'm going to kind of, so we're talking about financial education, for example, or greater regulation of credit. All great ideas, but I'm going to take a slightly different tack, is that I'm interested at the minute is how do we turn these kind of ideas into actual policy reality, because otherwise they're just going to remain a great set of ideas. And one question I'd like to ask to each of the panelists to cut across is thinking about how can we move from why is your idea well placed to win support amongst policymakers and actually become implemented in practice? So aside from getting Marcus Rashford to front your campaign, what is it that you think your proposal has that will be able to overcome the kind of barriers to convince policymakers to implement them? Because otherwise, the danger is they're great ideas, but actually just gather dust. So that's kind of my main overarching question. I've got just kind of some of the questions of already Jodie's kind of covered it, but I want to ask something follow up on financial education, in the sense that I think it's interesting. It's an interesting idea for sure. What about the view? How do you respond to the view that by focusing on financial education, sometimes actually we might want to think a bit more about financial institutions, and actually those people, for example, on lower incomes, they're actually quite well aware of how to spend the cash, but the problem is it's a problem with income. So I'm just interested in when we're looking at financial education, whether the focus should more be on sort of income or spending, because otherwise we kind of hone in on the individual and also overlooking, for example, the role that institutions would play. So that's kind of my institutional take on a great set of ideas.
Thanks, Rajiv. That's really helpful. Really great questions to ask across the panel as well. Do keep putting in questions in the Q&A. We're going to carry on to the final two friendly dragons, and then we'll look at the Q&A and then go back to the speakers for their reflections on these questions and comments. So our next friendly dragon is Sasha Romanovich, Chief Executive Officer of Fair for All Finance and previously Chief Executive Officer of Grant Thornton UK. So over to you, Sasha.
Hi, well, firstly, thank you everyone for all of your ideas. I've been scribbling notes ferociously. So, and I have to say that the previous dragons asked really fab questions. So I feel sorry for who gets to go last as dragon, because there's going to be nothing left to ask, right? one of my questions, and I think this maybe is one that's interesting to go across, is who bears the cost in terms of some of these proposals? Because Mike, in yours, I was really interested in terms of this idea of people losing their jobs. And one of the areas that I've been really looking at is, what does a great financially inclusive employer look like? What are the responsibilities of employers to their people to support them in their financial resilience? And certainly I don't have the data, but what's brilliant being on a call like this, someone will have it, right? So is how many employers were just paying statutory sick leave rather than actually topping it up. So just really interesting one in terms of just those income shocks and things like that. What is the role of employers and the commercial sector in actually behaving responsibly around people's income and income resilience, as opposed to all of that falling through into the state? So just really interesting one in terms of that balance of responsibilities, particularly because I think that a lot of the wealth inequality and distribution comes from actually companies perhaps not stepping up to their responsibilities in how they are paying and treating people. So maybe just that one for everybody to think about is, what is or could the role of employers be in sharing that responsibility? Second one, again, goes actually into sort of sharing responsibilities in burdens. There was a particular focus there in terms of regulation of buy now, pay later, Christoph. I'm also interested in terms of what are the responsibilities that we think retailers themselves should have. So anyone who's up early in the morning and suffers insomnia at all, menopausal woman, me a lot, if you're ever unfortunate enough to be looking at certain channels in the middle of the night, you'll notice that buy one, get free offers, all sorts of things to entice people into spending money, often go live in the early hours of the morning, going hand in hand with advantageous offers to get credit at that same time as well. So just really interested in terms of that sort of, thinking about where that responsibility lies, of are we focusing in the right place? Should we also be focusing on the responsibilities of retailers? Because I think that there is probably an awful lot that goes on in the marketplace in the name of consumer choice, which is actually exploiting people's vulnerabilities based on people knowing when people may be most be tempted to spend money that they shouldn't. So just a thought on that. Martin Kopak in the thread used his ex-life skills teacher. I'm not an ex-life skills teacher, but I am a parent of a 14-year-old boy. We know that in this country that over 50% of adults have the financial literacy skills of a 12-year-old child. And so just a really sort of a question in terms of, getting young children, particularly boys, to engage in maths is a challenge in and of itself. So how do you think you're going to actually get them to engage in financial education? And have you considered that the very things that are getting the consumer credit out there in terms of TikTok is where actually children may be much more likely to learn than in the classroom? So just a provocation there in terms of not saying that education isn't helpful, but where do we think they're more likely to learn? Could it be that the things that are causing harm could be turned to be used for good? And I'd be interested in everybody thinking about that. And then the final thing that I think I sort of would like to just put out there does go to some of the enforcement side of things. So one of the things that we did last year was around really debt collection standards, and government came together with some local authorities to actually set standards, and particularly around the use of bailiffs, because local authorities were the most likely to actually use those, which then put people into sort of a whole chain. So just really interested in terms of thinking about that in the round requirement in terms of local authorities and how that could make a difference. Overall, I just thought there were some fab ideas. So I found it really challenging to find questions to be a friendly dragon, but hopefully those give some to add into the mix.
Thanks, Sasha. Yeah, some great individual questions and some broad questions for all the panels. So there's going to be plenty to come back at when the speakers get their chance. But just before that happens, we've got our last friendly dragon. That's Muna Yassin, who's the Managing Director of Fair Money Advice, a London-based specialist debt advice charity. So Muna, over to you.
Thank you, Karen. And to follow Sasha, being the last dragon hopefully gives me a helicopter view on everything that's been said. So Fair Money Advice is a specialist debt advice charity, so it's lovely to hear Famida's perspective from a debt advice organisation. And I think we tend to have a view that has an insight that not a lot of our organisations get. We get to see the intimate kind of financial lives of people, and they share a lot more with their advisors, so that gives us a kind of privileged view. And so one of the things that's been really interesting this evening is actually seeing the correlation between a lot of the policies and a lot of the issues that our clients are facing and the emerging trends that we've seen over the last year. So I think it's very right that we focus on private renters. We supported over 44,000 Londoners as part of our debt-free London partnership last year. And of that, 1 in 5, 19% were private renters, and that's been a massive increase over the last few years. They are now at the same level of clients coming in from social housing in terms of housing associations. So you can see the level of change that's happening in the London market in terms of housing. We're also starting to see actually the number of people who are in rent arrears has gone up significantly over the last year. 48% of our client group presented with rent arrears. That's nearly half of people coming in through our doors. The other key thing that's really significant around that is the ethnicity of people who are affected by priority debts. So even though 48% of our clients coming through the doors were facing rent arrears, that number rose staggeringly to 57% for Black African communities and 59% for Black Caribbean communities. So I think any policies that work around reducing the kind of private rent burden on individuals is huge. I'm interested in some of the discussions around how you ensure that there's support for private renters. So I think the discussions around ensuring that Section 21 is a good process to go through, but I think it doesn't go far enough. I think reducing the arrears and repossession to 1 month actually is very counterproductive. And I think anything around that, and I didn't hear a lot of detail around how we kind of support that process. So I'd love to see a bit more policy area around that. I also think for me, focusing on income is a huge step forward. For years in the debt advice sector, we've had people talking about personal responsibility and resilience, and really shifting the issue back onto the individual when actually sometimes it's the systemic issues that are causing a lot of the problems. So I think thinking through around how we raise people's incomes when they are in difficulty is a very important point. To Mike's point around how furlough showed us what we can do and what we are capable of as a nation, I think is a really important one. I'd ask some questions around why only 3 months, because what we see within the debt advice sector is people are able to actually stagger on for the first month, second month, and by the third month, things start to run out. So when you're looking to remove that support is actually when it's needed the most. So I'd be interested to see, is that a 3-month deadline because politically that's what we think we can achieve? Or is that a 3-month deadline based on some statistics that I haven't yet seen? I think the issue around the excessive spending is very interesting around buy now, pay later. I think buy now, pay later, I think Jodie made the mention around whack-a-mole, you regulate one, another one comes along. I think it's more around really understanding, do we want to have a society where people who are borrowing, sometimes because of cost of living, and 9 times out of 10, it's not excessive spending, they're actually purchasing essential goods for their families and their children. Do we want to see a society where we have credit providers making money off people on the basis of their desperation? So do we want to ensure that there's regulation and regulatory support around ensuring that people are not exploited when they are making purchases because of their circumstances? I think the other thing that I can't disagree around the universal credit from Steve around larger families. I think that's just a horrendous policy that was put in place in the first place, and the quicker that we can remove that and roll that back, the better. I think for me, around the key thing around council tax, and I'm really pleased it was mentioned, but I think the issue of enforcement and bailiffs is something that this country really needs to look at. And I think we need to think about 21st century. Do we want to ensure that those that are most vulnerable are actually paying 3 times the amount for their services when you factor in the level of charges and fees that are applied to them? I think the other key thing around council tax support is not only are people not aware of the level of support that they should be receiving, but it's also the fact that actually it's something that's kept in the back pocket. It's not even advertised to residents that they are eligible for that. And it's normally when they go through a debt advice service or a third party that they become aware of it and it becomes an option to them. So I think it should be responsible for all local authorities to make sure that that's there and available from the get-go. And finally, I think I want to touch on a question for everybody around the fact that nobody has discussed debt advice and how we ensure that debt advice is available to people that are in need. And I know this is a hot potato and a hot topic at the moment, so I won't go into any controversial parts, but I do think there should be something in a discussion around, do we want to look at debt advice as a statutory advice sector? Do we want to ensure that people are able to access free and impartial debt advice, face-to-face, omni-channel, whichever way that they want to engage with that service? But do we want to make sure that it's there and it's something that we have as a kind of safety net for all people, like we do in our social security? So that's a really hot topic, and I'll leave that there. Thank you.
Wow, thanks, Muna. Thanks all to all the friendly dragons. There's been some brilliant forensic questions about the particular policy pitches and some broad questions for all of the speakers to reflect on, looking at who's responsible here, where does responsibility lie? Is it in individuals or institutions, and which institutions, employers, the retailers? What's the role of debt advice more broadly as well? And how do we get policy change? A great challenge from Rajiv there, really. You've got some great policy ideas, but how do we actually get them to happen in practice? That's probably another panel discussion, actually, but still, if you've got some thoughts on that. So I'm going to have a look in the Q&A and just throw a few more questions here, and then we'll go back for each speaker. You don't have to try and answer everything that you've been asked, because that would probably take us well until midnight, but just pick up 1 or 2 key points that you'd like to throw back into the mix. So let me have a quick check in the Q&A. So first of all, we had John Quill Lowe, who asks, how would you design financial education in schools to overcome the problem that technology and products change fast, so that what's taught in school may bear little relation to the products available when the young person becomes financially active? So for the example of buy now, pay later, which you know, if you talked about that 10 years ago, taught financial education, you wouldn't have covered that. So how do you tackle that? An anonymous attendee has asked, would creating a household income floor through universal basic income be another way of preventing people and families from living in poverty? So lots of discussion about UBI, universal basic income. If anybody wants to come back on that one, please do. Mary Alice Doyle has said, thanks Famida for providing a frontline and data-driven perspective. Do you think that the issue with council tax could be partly solved by increased take-up of council tax support? My impression from looking at aggregate data is that take-up of council tax support is very low among people who should be eligible, but I'm interested in whether you see council tax support take-up as an issue with your clients. And finally, and Wendy put this in the chat too, but a shout out about illegal lending and loan sharks, and that the illegal money lending team, who I think have a base in Birmingham, if I'm right, do have a website and a phone line and a live chat. So just to raise awareness of that as an issue. So I'm going to go back to our first speaker, who was Mike Brewer. You've had a few questions, Mike, so if you want to pick up anything there, just a couple of minutes. So actually, yeah, I've got a couple of minutes for each speaker, and we can always do another round if we've still got time later. But over to you, Mike, for any reflections and answers to any of the questions that you've been posed.
That's great. I think I'll keep mine fairly short. Sasha asked a fantastic question about what employers should be doing, and I definitely did focus on like what the state should be doing. And I suppose the reason why I focus on what the state should be doing is that my concern is for those on the lowest incomes or who have the kind of least protection. So ultimately we need to have the statutory fallback. But Sasha is absolutely right to raise the issue of what employers can do, and in the sort of topics I was talking about, what employers can do is provide better sick pay and even, I guess, better redundancy pay. I know that, so one way of encouraging employers to do that might be through things like the living wage accreditation. And I know there are various accreditations that employers can get for being good employers. I was talking to the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter, for example, and about the possibility, they were thinking about the possibility of requiring employers to pay sick pay. Or to pay sick pay at a certain, sorry, to do a top-up sick pay at a certain level. So that is one route in which you could get employers involved in this business of providing insurance to their workers in the event of shock. I think it'd be easier to do it for sick pay than it would be for redundancy pay, because usually when an employer makes somebody redundant, they don't care about them anymore. But yes, employers do have a role. And then Rajiv asked all of us to sort of think about how likely it is that so how could we sell these to government? And I think that question answers the challenge posed to me by Jodie and Muna, which was, why was I being so unambitious in only asking for 3 months protection capped at £2,500? And I have to say, I picked £2,500 because it aligns with the job retention scheme. And I picked 3 months so as not to freak out the Treasury. But of course, but both of those, we could be more generous. We could pay it for longer, but let's start with something more than just the £75 a week, which is what we have at the moment for basic unemployment benefit. I'll leave it there, Karen.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think I'm just trying to check in the chat. Somebody actually mentioned in the chat that in France, I think it's 2 years. Paul Spicker. And in other countries, in I think the Netherlands is the same.
We are towards the bottom of the OECD. So yes, pretty much every most European countries, most OECD countries pay more benefits for longer than we do. My proposal would make a dent in that, but would not put us at the top of the league table.
Thanks, Mike. That's great. Okay, over to our second speaker, Christoph. Would you like to come back to answer some of the questions or just make any comments you'd like?
Thank you very much. Super relevant questions raised, and I think we could talk a long time about these. So let me try very hard to stick within my 2 minutes, and maybe I can first touch the questions raised on the buy now, pay later schemes by Rajiv. Well, I guess by all of you. I hope to answer at least your questions in part. So Rajiv started off with asking, well, how to turn these ideas into policy reality. And I think regulators have already noticed that buy now, pay later is used by a large chunk of the population, almost a third, and it has risen tremendously even during the pandemic. So regulators have noticed this, and for that reason, they have commissioned this so-called Woolard review, which has been finished in February and is asking for regulation. I would ideally go beyond that even, but if the Woolard review would be implemented as it is, I think that would help already a lot. Unfortunately, that will take some time. Because now it's for consultation with the FCA, and later now with the Treasury. Later we'll go to the FCA for consultation. So it will take a while, but I think we have some awareness here of the problem. Now the question raised by Muda and also by Jodie on whether we regulate these few companies now, and then a new fintech with a new great idea pops up and circumvents all our regulation again. Will that happen, or how likely is it to happen? It's a very good question, and I think it's not as easy as one may think, because there is kind of a legal construction so that credit screening doesn't need to happen under what is called extension 60. So if somebody can stay outside consumer credit regime if they don't charge any interest or fees, and if the loan is paid back within 12 months by maximum 12 monthly installments. And this is what well, this is at the core where the Woolard review kicks in. And if this is regulated, if this extension 60F cannot be used anymore, then I think that it raises also a lot of possibilities for other fintechs to go around this and essentially exploit people simply because we cannot screen them and we have no idea whether they have huge debt already with a different company. So once this, I may call it loophole, some legal person may correct me here, but once this is closed, I think people who are in problem debt can be much better protected because we have a much better overview where they have debt. And very briefly to touch also Sasha's point there. So when we talk about or think about the buy now, pay later, we often have the so-called partner model in mind. These are the companies like Klarna, etc., who are not the retailers but third parties. But essentially, some retailers do the same. They also do buy now, pay later under the so-called merchant model. There is nothing else. So essentially, hopefully, these ads that show up in the middle of the night cannot be implemented anymore once extension 60F is not a possibility anymore. So hopefully we can resolve this issue there as well and get some more liability or better credibility there of the third parties and the merchants as well. I believe I'm out of 2 minutes, but if I have just one more second to answer Junkwheel's question on how to teach in schools, I think what we need to teach our kids is general tools. Clearly, we don't know what's coming in future, but at the moment, nothing is taught. Lots of kids come out with a very, very limited understanding of what are their interests, what is the interests of a financial intermediary, what does it mean, interest rates on debt, on your savings, etc. What we need to develop is kind of a culture where we know and understand what debt is, what the risks are, what the opportunities are, and why we should also save. And very briefly to touch on Sasha's comment, how to teach kids. I think teaching via TikTok might work, but there's also dangerous content and content from people who have their own interests on TikTok. So I think ideally in schools, the teacher points the pupils to the very, very valuable resources that are on TikTok, YouTube, etc. And hopefully we develop something like video game type simulations so that financial education in schools is actually interesting and not just the pure math of calculating how much interest you get in 3 years. I think back to my youth, still very happily playing the football manager and saving for my stadium. So I would hope that others can benefit from that too. And I'll leave it with that.
Thanks, Christoph. Yeah, making this fun, I suppose, in some ways will be a helpful way to learn. It's always the best way to learn. So next speaker, and then what I'm going to do after our two speakers have had their chance to respond, I'll do the audience vote, and then if there's time, we'll have a very quick roundup to the Friendly Dragons for a last sort of word in response to the audience vote. So Steve, and then Famida, and then we'll go to the audience vote. So over to you, Steve.
Okay, and apologies, I keep disappearing behind a branded advert. Hopefully it won't happen too much. Just so I'll make 3 very quick points. The first, Jodie asked about why fertility is dropping so much. And in the evidence so far, it seems the main effect is fewer people moving from no kids to 1 kid, rather than not moving from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 or 3 onwards. So at the moment, it seems to be that fewer non-parents are becoming parents, but then that could change. That could change over time. It may take a while before the full effects of the child limit really cut in. In terms of public support, I mean, I think there's a well-known thesis that says that our post-war welfare state grew out of the wartime conditions and the sense of shared risk. And I think there are kind of 2 discourses really around the pandemic. And I think the positive spin would be that having gone through the pandemic and seeing what government can do in situations of shared risk in order to enact quite radical policies, the optimistic view would be if people can drum up this spirit of the pandemic, the spirit of Marcus Rashford, MBE, as he is today. So that might be kind of one way to try and leverage a kind of new investment, and to sort of talk about this sense of shared risk we felt during the pandemic. Although the more pessimistic answer will say we'll just go back to where we were before rather quickly. Time will tell. And third, on debt advice, I should say my declared interest. My partner was one of the first Citizens Advice 5th face-to-face debt advisors back in the day. So I know a fair bit about what's going on in that world, and I think I mean, as it was mentioned, we need to kind of try to protect at least some element of face-to-face debt advice going forward, because that's clearly under a lot of pressure with these changes to the MAPS contracts. So I need to be supportive of that.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and sorry for the technical hitches there, but we've been remarkably free. I shouldn't say that, should I? Because that's that's kind of curse us now, but been remarkably free of technical hitches. But thanks for that. And we'll go next to our last speaker, Famida, Rahman. Any responses, Famida, to the questions? You've had a few there, or the more general questions as well. If you'd like to make some response, that would be great.
Yeah. So one of the issues that came up a few times for me was to do with council tax, and particularly enforcement of council tax. And I'm glad that came up, because that was actually the section of my presentation that I skipped when I realised I was running out of time. And so I think it was Jodie at the very beginning who sort of did a read off of our stats and basically explained a lot of the problems with council tax enforcement. But I'll just say this. So one of the big issues that we see with council tax is outdated and inefficient collection methods, and particularly when someone misses a single monthly instalment, they're at risk of becoming liable for their entire annual bill. So it sets off a trigger of escalation. And now if this can't be paid, the council must then get a liability order from the courts to take action to collect debts. And this adds on average another £84 to people's bills, making it yet harder to repay. Most councils then use unregulated bailiffs to pursue money owed. And bailiff enforcement often involves aggressive tactics, rejected affordable payment plans, and large additional fees onto people's bills. And so one thing that we do advocate for quite a lot is a massive reform of collection practices. And we see, so I was recently sort of supporting Barking and Dagenham Council with a review of some of their innovative responses to services, and they had set up an ethical collections practice, which worked with clients, I'm always talking about clients, with residents in council tax arrears, to sort of take a preventative approach. So they'd work with them to sort of go through income maximisation processes, go through debt advice processes, to refer them through housing advice. And they actually found that through doing that, they were sort of seeing wider council savings. They were facilitating much more write-off of council tax debt, and so the sort of short-term cost was smaller, but the trade-offs of that in terms of cost to the council in total was lower, because of all this other action, all this other preventative action that was sort of preventing much more longer-term hardship. And so in terms of our package, we sort of propose proactive contact, so making efforts to contact individuals who've fallen behind and reviewing where arrears have built up, setting up affordable payment plans, and actually considering write-off where there is no realistic prospect that they can pay in full, so that people facing severe financial difficulty are dealt with compassionately rather than punitively. I think that's really important, and I'm really glad that was raised. And then so I think so Muna asked a question about support for private renters, and again we've sort of briefly mentioned that the government have been consulting on removing section 21, which will of course improve security a lot, but within that they've sort of put out there that they were thinking of reducing the grounds of repossession to 1 month, and that would be a mandatory ground for eviction if a person has 1 month's worth of rent arrears, and that is not discretionary. And I think that sort of what that does is effectively reinforces all the problems that I've spoken about. So people at fear of sort of building up 1 month of arrears, which a month of rent arrears is actually more than like the average person's monthly income, or like typical rent arrears are more than the sort of average arrears or something like that. But yeah, so it's sort of, what it does is it exacerbates that problem whereby people sort of look to alternative routes to meet their rental costs for fear of eviction. They look to high cost credit, they look to other forms of unsustainable debt. And so what we think should happen is that the ground aid should absolutely be discretionary to the courts, and people should be supported when they are sort of struggling with arrears so that they can sort of find their way back and they're not sort of turfed out by default. And that this sort of speaks to Rajiv's question about costs and why should the government fund this, because these policies, both this and sort of better, like more compassionate enforcement and support for council tax, because they prevent longer term problems. It prevents homelessness, it prevents people escalating into worse debt problems, worse financial problems. And as Karen said at the very start, that debt problems are hugely correlated with mental health issues, a lot of issues with suicide. And so it prevents problems further down the line. And just the last sort of question to pick up is whether to ensure that, should debt advice be a statutory service? 100% it should be. Martin Kopak, I think, very helpfully popped our Life Happens report in the chat, and I'd recommend you all read that because it sort of highlights the risk that every single person is out of sort of finding themselves in this situation. Like a lot of people, most people, if not, experience a life event in some point in their life. They get ill, they might become disabled, they might lose their job or experience relationship breakdown, and all of those people can happen to anyone, but they can trigger debt problems which escalate and escalate and escalate. And so there should always be those provisions in place to support people who are falling into those problems.
Thanks, Famida. That was a fantastic response to many questions, sort of quite detailed, and the broader questions, the broader issues here. Very powerful. Thank you for that. So I think if our tech support, that's Louise Volchuk, I think, if she can put the poll back up so that the audience can vote again on our 7 ideas. Thank you very much, Louise. Please do vote. I realize I could have shared the results, and I will do shortly. So please vote for up to 3, your top 3 choices for what we should do to try and tackle problem debt. I'll give you a moment or two. I'll keep an eye on the numbers, and then in a moment we will got about 20% have voted. Keep going. Have a few more. That's interesting. I won't tell you what the results are until we've got most people voting. Up to 3 based on strictly, somebody asked. I'm not sure I understand that. Okay, 75% participation. Nearly 90%. So if a couple more people would like to vote, and then I'm going to end the poll. Oh, 100%. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Let's see. I hope you can see those. Can you see those? Please, no. Okay, I'll try again. Share results. Yes, brilliant. Thank you. So the top one was increased benefits for people on low incomes, as people perhaps see that as a cause, a fundamental cause of debt problems. Reduced council tax and policies to reduce the cost of renting, both coming out strongly. Then regulation of consumer credit, financial education, and more support for private renters coming out as well. And the last one, which we didn't really talk so much about today, but more support for people to save as a way to prevent, I suppose, problem debt occurring, but that receiving less support. So those are the finds. I think things have changed a bit from the first poll, a little bit. So that's interesting, and hopefully the debate has helped people to think a bit more about what the priorities might be. So I'm going to just now, lastly, just for a minute each, if that's okay for the friendly dragons, I'll move the poll, or if Louise can. Go back around to the friendly dragons for a last word, really. Anything they'd like to raise that hasn't either been discussed or any key point they'd like to make, and then I'll just draw it to a close with a few thanks and so on. But if we go back to Jodie, if Jodie's still with us for any final reflections, just very briefly.
I feel bad that I started and the later dragons had a hard time. So if you want to do in reverse order, I'm more than happy to try and think of something at the end.
Okay, should we do that? If Muna is ready, would you like to go first, Muna?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So for me, I think my biggest reflection is that all of those are really strong policy areas, and I think there's a combination of things that we need to look at rather than looking at things in isolation. I didn't speak a lot about financial education in the time that I had previously, so I think I'll focus there. For me, I think there's a benefit to teaching young people, but actually, if we just focus on young people, it means that we're writing off a whole generation. And obviously, we work with adults who are in extreme debt problems. And within that, there is still space and time for people to pick up skills. So they're not continuously in the same process over and over again. So what I would say is that life events are not just life shocks, but life events, we all go through them. You graduate from university, you start your first job, you get married. All of those life events for me represent teachable moments. So I think what we need to think about is education that's throughout our lifetimes, rather than just thinking that we have a short spurt of financial education whilst we're in school, and that should be enough for us to kind of continue. Things continually evolve, that the credit sector changes, but also our lifestyles and our kind of priorities change. So I think the education needs to kind of fit within that as well. So I think I'll leave that there. Make sure that I'm within the 1 minute.
Thanks, Mina. It's a really important point, so thank you for that. Next, we're going in reverse order. It's Sasha, your final thoughts on all these issues we've discussed so far today.
So I'd agree, it's a cracking set of policy ideas. I think that particularly is interesting, the private rental one, and actually this sort of equity in terms of, if you're in, if you've got a mortgage versus if you're in private rental. I just think there is something really powerful there when we're pointing out real sort of unfairness in terms of how the system operates on something like that. I think that's a really powerful loop. And I suppose I just encourage everyone, I think, to Muna's point, I think we do need to think holistically about things. And there are sort of two bits that sort of tie together, which is, one is how you get information to people at the right time. I often think about it at the moments that matter in terms of life events and the collective responsibilities of employers, of educators, but also of the benefit system itself, to be able to actually help, give people really easy information at the point in time when they're making decisions, because I think everything shows that that's when people need the information, and for that information to be designed in a way that actually reflects that numeracy levels are pretty low, because there's loads of research that most financial education is done by numerate people and it works for numerate people but not for other people. So I think that there is just something in there in terms of that overall sort of what are the parts everybody can play in that system to help people in terms of their decisions. And I think that then that resilience of income, we talk a lot about benefits, and we also know that significant numbers of people in problem debt are in employment. And so the responsibilities of employers to actually support people are really important. We all know the links between mental health and problem debt for people. And, so I think there is a really good rationale for employers to be able to actually provide better support. We when we set up as an organisation, we looked at everything that could actually build out financial resilience, from sick pay through to income protection, through to critical illness, and put in place a whole lot. And the fascinating thing is that for people to put that in place individually would have been prohibitively expensive. To do it as an employer was actually doable. I think we wanted to test it out. So I think that, think about, rather than thinking about just one actor on the stage who can influence it, to think about that interaction between public, private and not-for-profit, to always think about all three, because oftentimes what's unaffordable for one to bear on its own becomes possible if you bring together the resources of all three.
That's great. Thank you very much. It's very much, as you say, about this holistic approach. Given the scale of the problem, then different actors, individuals, employers, financial services, retailers, all have to take responsibility for this. Thank you very much for that. Next, and yeah, just not the last, but penultimate, Rajiv, over to you for a final word or two on this.
Yeah, 2 quick points. First, all the panelists' ideas were fantastic. I've certainly learned a lot. If you'd have asked me to be in their position and come up with ideas, I don't think I would have come up with anything as good as they did. So I think, and I really liked, and the fellow Friendly Dragons who kind of drilled down into the detail. So you can see the kind of the wealth of expertise within the virtual room. And I kind of, a point I'd like to make just on that. I mean, obviously some of these ideas, they're not mutually exclusive, but I think, I'm just to return to my kind of overriding point, it's kind of where we go from here, because what I don't want is to have all these great ideas and it just doesn't end up anywhere, because I think all the ideas that were made by the different panelists, I think can have a real impact. And what I don't want is, oh, this is just another webinar with another set of ideas that never actually ever gets implemented. So I think the actual thing about how we actually put this into practice is an important one. And just the second final point, just on the audience thought, actually. So I've done in praise of the panelists. Also, I think I'm in praise of the audience thought as well, because when I think about that increasingly now, I do tend to think that actually, is it really an issue of income? And so I found it heartening in a way that the kind of most popular choice, you know, the wisdom of the masses, I guess. All right, thanks.
Well, I'd love to say the masses were here, but it's a relatively small number, but a very welcome audience. So thanks for that. And I absolutely take the point about how do we get action from this, because we've mentioned the scale of the problem, both in terms of numbers and the depth of that, what that means for individuals. So yeah, absolutely. As a group, including the audience, we need to think about how we go forward and work together as a kind of coalition, perhaps, to try to work on this. Anyway, thanks very much for that, Rajiv. That's really helpful. And then our final friendly dragon, and you have been very, very friendly, all of you, which is great. Over to Jodie for a final word or two, and then I'll wrap up. So over to you, Jodie. Thank you.
So now here's where I'm regretting my generosity, because all of the good points have been taken and I have very little to say. One really minor point, and this might be very linguistical, but the clear front runner was increasing benefits to low-income people. Now, it depends on how we want to use benefits, that term, but I think increasing wages is also a really important thing. In-work poverty is real and it's increasing. And a lot of that would be solved by putting the minimum wage up. And in fact, you'd see, I hate to use the phrase trickle down, I'm talking about trickle down in our kind of problem hierarchy, because the moment we start paying people, then a lot of the other issues would start to be minimized and come into play. But I think it also shows how all of these really work together. One thing is not going to solve all of the problems, and the solution is going to be a number of them working together and a number of us working together. And the key thing is just going to be making poor people less poor. And because that's very unlikely to happen under the current government, it's about thinking of other different ways that we can tackle the issue, but never losing sight of the real cause of the problem, which is low income and low wages.
Thanks, Jodie. That's really helpful. And I know that so many, you and many others in this group are actively working to do more research on debt and more policy relevant research. And I think it's been great to have that mix of academics and practitioners, think tankers, and within the audience a mix of expertise as well. So thank you very much for that. I won't try to sort of sum up because there's been so much covered. I'm just going to, because we're also running out of time, but just a huge thanks to many people behind the scenes: Helen Ackers, George Merriman, Louise Valchuk, who's been our tech support today, Kira Wasson and Chelsea Wood. Our speakers have been fantastic in putting forward their policy ideas. Our dragons have been extremely friendly, but also great in terms of pointing out particular issues and questions and broader points that we need to reflect on. So it's been fantastic. And for the audience, some fantastic points made in the chat, some great questions in the Q&A. So thank you for your participation. Thank you for voting. We will reflect on how we take this all forward. So do keep an eye out for other events as we go forward. And we will think very seriously about what we can do to achieve change, because this problem is not going away, it seems. I'm afraid, you know, with the winter coming, prices going up, incomes going down, you know, this is not a problem that's going away. So we need to think about how we can change. So thank you very much. The evaluation link is in the chat. We'll send you an email anyway. Please do give us feedback on this event so we can improve events in future. And I will now let you all go to your dinners, or maybe watch the Great British Bake Off later on if that's your kind of thing. And thank you so much, everybody, and keep in touch and take care, everybody. Bye bye. Bye bye.